Well, good evening, Mr. Rector, or Magnificent Rector, friends, students, guests, and of course, our speaker. Tonight, I would like to welcome you to the first post-Chinese New Year talk hosted by the University of St. Joseph, the Department of History and Heritage, and by our partners, longtime partners by now, the Rui Cunha Foundation. And I am delighted to be able to welcome here tonight Professor Josh Ehrlich, an award-winning historian of knowledge and political thought, who came to Macau a few years ago. I think even before he came here, one of my friends had recommended to me that I should get in touch with him, and so we did get in touch, but I think every time you suggested something for about a year, I was busy that day, and vice versa. But finally, we did manage to meet up. Josh Ehrlich, before he came to Macau, studied first at the University of Chicago, where he got his BA, and then at Harvard University, where he received his MA and PhD. And he came out to Macau working on an institution which has been part of Macau's history for many decades, the East India Company. 2 or 3 weeks ago, many of you attended another lecture there in the headquarters, what had been the headquarters of the East India Company, one of its many incarnations, of which the latest is that it is the Macau headquarters of the Orient Foundation. It was also not merely a powerful, or not to say notorious, corporation, but it was also one of the world's most enlightened ones. Just before the holiday, I wandered round the garden where East India Company officials and others helped to gather together plants from across East and Southeast Asia, many of which were sent on to Kew Gardens to be installed there under the patronage of Queen Charlotte and others. This was only one of the East India Company's many ventures into knowledge and learning, about which we are going to hear more tonight from Josh Ehrlich. And he points out that these historical actors were highly articulate at the time on what they were doing, but their ideas continue to resonate in the present, with knowledge being a fixture in today's politics, and perhaps also a commodity, just like some of the others that the East India Company was trading in. As one who's been spending quite a lot of time in the past few days working on the history of higher education in Macau and some of the political and commercial debates that ensued from that, I have a certain fellow feeling. These ideas resonate with much more recent developments, not just in Macau, but across the world. So, having given you that introduction, I am sure that Professor Ehrlich is going to tell us a great deal more about this subject, of which I have only just scratched the surface. So over to you, Josh.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Roberts, for a very learned introduction, which set the ground, I think, very well for what I'm going to be talking about over the next 45 minutes or so. Is that about right? If I see people sleeping, I'll cut it short. And I'm aware that this is really a kind of mixed audience, online and in person, academics and friends and members of the public. So I will pitch this somewhere in the middle, and you can pull me into the weeds or pull me out of it in the Q&A as the situation may require. I think this question about knowledge and the politics of knowledge, knowledge as a commodity, exactly how we conceptualize knowledge and make it part of our politics, has so many points of entry in today's world. But I will just start with one, which is what happened recently to the archives, the main archives of the East India Company in London. They reside at the British Library, and that library was, back in October, hacked and taken offline so that no one could use the catalog, no one could even use the Wi-Fi in the institution. It was really a terrible event for many scholars. And of course, the goal of the hackers was to get the British Library to pay them to restore the services and buy back the personal data of the staff who worked at the library and all of this. But for some months, there was this question over what would happen to all, at least the records, the catalogs and indexes of the company's records. Was this a commodity that could be bartered by whoever seized control over it? Was it a public good that ought to be protected from such efforts? All these kind of questions that I think the company itself was so involved in for decades and maybe centuries, as I explore in my book, came right back to the surface with this hacking event. And the indexes, the databases online are slowly being put back together and hopefully will be available in the next few months, at least in a partial capacity. But I was reminded yet again of the contemporary relevance, the contemporary salience of a lot of the issues raised by the company and delved into in my book. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about this book, and maybe I'll stand up. It's a bit more natural for me when I lecture. This is the cover of the book. It came out about 6 months ago, and it's hopefully going to be available at a more affordable price in paperback soon. Friends who have asked where they can buy the book, I've generally told them it's okay if you want to wait and not pay over $100 for this book. But it started, even if it came out quite recently, started about 10 years ago when I was a lowly PhD student casting about for a topic, somewhat desperately trying to think what I could really hope to contribute as a historian or budding historian. And as I was reading a lot that summer, the summer of 2013, I came across a pamphlet by the minor French philosopher, Jacques-Pierre Brissot. He would later be involved in the French Revolution, but in the early 1780s, he was kind of a wannabe philosopher, a wannabe Enlightenment figure, living as an expatriate across the Channel in London. And he had this idea for a learned society that was going to gather the world's knowledge, publicize it, circulate it. And here's what he wrote about the East India Company. Commerce may be rendered subservient to the promotion of science, and the same ship that carries the East India Company's orders to Calcutta, its capital in India, may likewise carry the new instruments or the new work, and may bring back the Indian book for the student of Göttingen or the professor of Oriental languages at Paris. I was immediately struck by this quote. I've been reading about the East India Company as this expansive power by the 1780s, an organization that threatened to become an empire within the British Empire, an empire unto itself. It had already taken over the province of Bengal, the richest province of the Mughal Empire, the richest empire in the world in the 18th century, and it was spreading in North India and South India. So by the 1780s, to see it portrayed as still this merchant operation, trading goods back and forth, struck me as a bit surprising. Moreover, the company at this time, I knew from reading around, was being criticized at both ends of its operations by writers and speakers in London and in Europe, and also by Indians. Indian critics were pointing up its rapacity, its violence, its greed. So then to see it portrayed not only as a merchant at a time when it was a great territorial sovereign, but also to see it portrayed as this enlightened spreader of knowledge at a moment when it was notorious for its violence and its extractive activities, again, was really striking to me, and I wondered what Brissot was up to. Well, I quickly found out that Brissot was not making these things up, at least not inventing this rhetoric himself. He was picking it up very directly, like a magpie, from the East India Company and its promoters. The company itself had been starting to advance this rhetoric to defend its activities, and it was going to do so for a number of decades after this moment. And as soon as I learned that, I started to see this long history of the company using knowledge, using its activities in support of knowledge to defend its character against its critics. That's really what my book is about. So I'm going to introduce the East India Company a little bit and why it was so involved in knowledge for political purposes. I'm going to present the argument of my book, talk about some of its interventions in the scholarship. I'm going to, I think pretty quickly by this point, since you may not want to hear so much detail, talk about the content of the book, and then end with some of the present-day relevance of this story, why the company's activities and political thinking about knowledge is in many ways relevant to us today. I opened with that, and I'm going to return to it in my conclusion. If you've heard of the East India Company, you might have heard it called things like the world's most powerful corporation. As Professor Roberts mentioned, it was also long known as maybe the world's most notorious corporation. In its own day, and maybe even still today, thanks to the popularity of books by William Dalrymple and others. The company was founded in 1600 to manage English trade with Asia, known in a very vague geographical term as the East Indies. And from the very beginning, it was not exactly a corporation like we might think of corporations today. It was a company state, a hybrid entity that had both political and commercial privileges. So, for instance, it was empowered to conduct diplomacy on its own behalf, to negotiate and make agreements with Asian rulers, to rent land and manage people residing on its land and working on its ships. It was empowered to raise armies, something that's very hard to imagine a company being granted the right to do today. I mean, there are sort of, mercenary security forces and things like that, but still not quite on the same scale. It was empowered to mint its own currency. Again, something it's hard to imagine a company doing today. It made it administer laws in law courts, run by employees that it hired as judges and lawyers. And overall, it was the governor of its territories, its trading posts initially on a small scale, but ultimately over large swaths of the Indian subcontinent, parts of Southeast Asia as well. In fact, all of these rights become much more important as the company's political role grows, as its political footprint expands. Its hybrid character as a company state begins to seem much more threatening, much more anomalous, much more unwieldy in the 18th and 19th centuries. So as I say, the company was founded all the way back in 1600, but a momentous occasion is the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when it first conquers extensive territory. That's what sets it on this path of territorial expansion and large-scale sovereignty, from which it never turns back until it's dissolved 100 years afterward. And there are a few other stages in this process by which it ceases to become a trader, ultimately, and remains only as this large-scale sovereign. By 1818, it's the paramount power in India. It has no major rival. It's defeated the Marathas in the west, the Mughal Empire, this formerly great empire, in the center and across much of India, and Mysore in the south. It's three major rivals in the later 18th and early 19th century. Its trade is first contracted by a parliamentary regulation in 1813 and ultimately wound down completely in 1833. So as it's emerging as this territorial power, its role as a commercial power is shrinking, ultimately abolished. Finally, the company loses power in India, which has been regulated and controlled more and more by Parliament, but still given a degree of independence up until the last moment in 1857 after the Great Indian Uprising, the Sepoy Mutiny. So just to give you a quick sense of this momentous series of changes in the company's character, it starts off its campaign of expansion in the east of India, in Bengal, expands further by the turn of the 19th century, having defeated Tipu Sultan of Mysore in the south, for instance, one of the major phases. And you can see that by the end of its existence, it's in control of big patches of India. But actually that control goes even further because it has residents embedded in the courts of native sovereigns across India, native princes, who are in fact controlling a lot of the external policy of these quasi-independent Indian states. So the company's power is even greater than it appears on the map, because it has an informal empire covering much of the Indian subcontinent. Not shown even here are places like Singapore, Penang, Malacca, which are also part of the company's operation, and its factory in Canton too. These maps don't show that, but they were a part of its empire too. So as it's expanding territorially and politically, it's contracting commercially. It loses its monopoly on Indian trade. Competitors are allowed into the trade with India, and the company is outcompeted very quickly. Its trade dwindles. By 1833, it loses its remaining monopoly on the China route. That's open to private traders too, and then really it has no remaining commercial operation except kind of informally as an umbrella organization for private traders. There's an interesting story to be told there. It still maintains some commercial links, but it's not a major trader after this period. As the company evolved into this large-scale territorial ruler, it struggled to justify this hybrid character. It became this point of ridicule that the company had been entrusted to manage huge territories, this little merchant operation based in an office in Leadenhall Street in London. Why was it being granted such power over millions of Indian subjects? The company was desperate for means to legitimize itself, to legitimize its hybrid constitution as a company state. If either its commercial or political role was taken away, it was thought its entire operations would be wound up and folded into the British government, perhaps, as ultimately happened. But in the meantime, it was desperate for ways to legitimize its operations. And it turned, in large part, to knowledge to do so, to ideas about knowledge. It needed justification, and this is, I argue, where it found it. One of the places that it found it. The company indeed claimed to be not only the most powerful corporation, but also the most enlightened one, as we saw refracted in Rousseau's, or echoed in Rousseau's rhetoric. Now, I hasten to add that we may not believe this claim. The company was notorious in its own day for violence and extraction, and there are many reasonable grounds for such claims. But even if we don't believe the claim, I argue that we should take it seriously at an ideological level. We should take it seriously as a claim that the company made and then had to some extent, live up to, became accountable to. I think this is how ideology works, if we define it as simply a set of ideas used to legitimate political action, a very basic definition of ideology. It ends up shaping and binding action. To maintain credibility, you have to live up to the promises you've laid out, at least to some extent, with a high degree of flexibility, yes. But if you've announced an ideology, announced a set of values and intentions, you're then expected to uphold those by the people you've announced it to, by those power holders that you've hoped to convince and on whose power you're relying to stay in power yourself. So the company's commitment to knowledge became central to its ideology, and it was forced over time to live up to this commitment, at least up to a point. And that's why I think it matters, even if we take it with a grain of salt. Having stated this ideological commitment to knowledge, It was forced and bound into a set of patronage activities and ultimately mass education policies in India and beyond. And so I'm working up here to my argument, which unfolds in the course of an introduction, 5 chapters, and a conclusion in the book. This is a history of ideas of knowledge, and I'll get to how this is a distinct approach in a moment. The book traces ideas of and about knowledge that were used by the company and its advocates to legitimize its hybrid character, to legitimize its existence as this weird thing, a company and a state. Something that was not so weird in the early modern period, but became increasingly so by the later 18th century. And throughout the book, I reconstruct a series of knowledge debates that involve the company and its critics, both European and Indian critics. These debates were not only happening in Britain and in Europe, they were also happening on the ground in India, and traveling back and forth through print and through other means. A larger point of the book is to situate what to us today often seems like a very new thing, politics of knowledge, in historical perspective, to say that actually political debates around knowledge are not a new phenomenon, new as they may seem to us. There's a long history of these debates, and we can learn something from those. We can recover resources from those that we might use in today's debates around knowledge. And that's where I'll end my talk. So with this argument about the company becoming ideologically invested in knowledge, using ideas about knowledge to legitimize its hybrid company-state character, I make a number of interventions, and here's maybe where I will speak a bit briefly, so as not to bore you too much. I think generally people are not so interested in hearing about historiography when it comes to a public talk, but I will kind of go through this quickly and give you a chance to ask more about it in the Q&A if it's of interest in any way. So as I've said, this is a history of ideas of knowledge, which is something a bit different both from the history of ideas, intellectual history, a very well-established field, and also the history of knowledge, a somewhat newer field. I'm combining these two approaches in certain ways. The history of knowledge, the newer field, is really an offshoot of social history, cultural history, and the history of science. Its emphasis is on systems, institutions, structures, but not on ideas. And for instance, it's often concerned with the rise and fall of past knowledge, systems, economies, even revolutions. Some of the classic works in this young field talk about the history of knowledge from Gutenberg to Google or Alexandria to the internet, and they tell stories of changing systems, changing structures. They're not so interested in how people in the past understood knowledge, how they understood structures of knowledge around them. It's a very retrospective search for meaning, applying our own categories to the past, not interested in categories that arose from the past. And thus it's near synonymous with histories of information and intelligence. Knowledge, information, and intelligence are more or less the same for these kinds of historians. A few examples here, and you see some of those subtitles I mentioned. Here's another one, From the Age of Reason to the Age of Algorithms. Again, looking at how structures of knowledge change, systems of knowledge change, not from the perspective of the people who lived through those changes at all. So what's missing? I've already alluded to it, kind of, haven't I? The history of knowledge so far has examined intellectual environments rather than intellectual problems, in the words of its greatest proponent, Peter Burke. The culture, but not the contents of political discourse. Well, I'm interested actually in the contents of political discourse. It's eschewed the focus on historical actors' utterances and aims that's characteristic, meanwhile, of intellectual history, including the history of political thought. So there is, in fact, another group of historians very interested in how people in the past conceptualized things like knowledge. And in fact, I think if this field does seek to inform knowledge debates in the present, it ought to be recovering earlier debates in the terms in which they were waged. We ought to understand how people in the past thought about knowledge and its political uses, how they developed rhetorics around knowledge, how they used ideas about knowledge to legitimize their actions. we ought to be recovering these debates in the terms in which they were actually fought out. This is a task really suited to the methods of intellectual history, which is all about situating texts in contexts, recovering the utterances and aims of historical actors. Some classics in this field include books like this, and you get a sense of what they're about. Meaning in Context, recovering what Locke was up to when he wrote his 2 treatises of government. This is a really classic work in the Anglo-American contextualist approach to intellectual history. Or more recently, turning this approach to studying empire. Intellectual history, meanwhile, has its own gaps, its own flaws, I think. One of these is that it's not really concerned with knowledge, that key concern of the history of knowledge. And it hasn't recognized yet that knowledge was a significant concern for historical actors themselves. It's looked at things like the state, the economy, many, many big important concepts, but knowledge has not been one of them. Individual intellectual historians have looked at the politics of historiography, for instance, and of other branches of knowledge, but not knowledge itself, not this big category of knowledge. We have no genealogy of knowledge, no history tracing all the concepts of knowledge and its cognates and alternatives over time, like we do have for things like the state. And I think ultimately this is a worthy enterprise for intellectual historians to extend their treatment to knowledge. They would have a response, for instance, to Foucault's famous power-knowledge equation. Michel Foucault, the great 20th century philosopher and historian, argued that power and knowledge were the same thing. Well, intellectual historians, I think, have never dealt with that challenge, never dealt with that proposition. Power and knowledge, I think, these historians are in a good place to show, have had a contingent relationship. They're not the same thing. They've been related to each other in all kinds of different ways across time. And they have a relationship that can be endlessly rethought and remade. That's, I think, a valuable insight we would get if intellectual historians would think more about knowledge as a category. So to sum up so far and bring back some of the flagging members of the audience who may be tired of this kind of historiographical discussion, the history of knowledge has been unconcerned with ideas. The history of ideas has been unconcerned with knowledge. That's why I aim to propose a new approach, the history of ideas of knowledge, taking the concern of this new field and marrying it to methods of the old field. Basically, that's what I'm doing. There are 2 ways to do this. You could, maybe more than 2 ways, but at least 2 ways to do this. You could track the changing meanings of knowledge over time. That's not actually what I'm doing in the book. I'm doing the second thing, looking at how ideas of or about knowledge arose and changed in the context of political debates. How is knowledge invoked? How is knowledge thought about as part of political debates? Not looking at exactly, knowledge is defined this way, then this way, then this way, but looking at how it becomes part of these debates, how it's a term in these debates, and how it's thought about in the course of political argument. This has a lot of benefits, I think and hope. We would recognize that historical actors themselves have been highly articulate on the subject of knowledge. It's not only modern philosophers like Michel Foucault who can do this. People for a long time have been thinking about knowledge and political argument. And again, we would situate our own politics of knowledge in historical perspective and recover materials for use in our own knowledge debates, were we to take seriously this approach, the history of ideas of knowledge, as I do in the context of the company in this book. Now, I'm going to just go through this very quickly, but a lot of the sorts of gaps that we've seen in the history of knowledge have really applied, especially when it comes to histories of the East India Company's engagements with knowledge. These give us a good example of what's missing so far and what might be gained from a new approach, the new approach I've suggested. So we see really these same kinds of cultural and structural approaches to the company's engagements with knowledge in previous histories of that subject. I think this field is ripe for reinvention with my new approach. So I want to tell you a little bit about the actual contents of the book, having told you my general argument and how I hope it's doing something new, building on and offering alternative to existing scholarship. I want to tell you a little bit about what actually happens in the book, who some of the characters are, and some of the stories that emerge from these chapters. The story begins in the 1770s. The first Governor General of Bengal, the leader of the East India Company in India, Warren Hastings, enters a scene of turbulence when he arrives in Bengal. The company is being criticized for its new conquests, which it's just committed to governing directly after trying to hide behind Indian intermediaries for about a decade. And he uses a series of knowledge activities to justify the company's new role, to legitimize its activities, to show that it's a competent governor of these provinces and can maintain its role as both a merchant and a sovereign, even in the face of its new challenges. He compiles Hindu and Islamic law codes. He founds colleges, a madrasa or Muslim college in Calcutta, and he starts the ball rolling on a Hindu analog upcountry in Benares. He sends out expeditions to Bhutan and Tibet, places almost unknown to Europeans, except for several earlier Jesuit missions there. And all of this is part of what he calls a system of conciliation, a very resonant word in the 18th century. The idea, as he talks about it in private letters as well as public addresses, is that he's going to defend the company state by patronizing European scholar officials and Indian learned elites. These scholars, both Indian and European, are influential with power holders in India and in Europe. They hold sway with the kind of people that Hastings needs to have on board to maintain power and justify power. And this language of conciliation does a few other things too. It's an idea befitting both a merchant and a sovereign. Kings can conciliate. Merchants can also conciliate. This term has a slippery meaning. It can refer to a kind of merchant art of trade and bartering. It can also refer to how a king wins over subjects. So it's fitting for this sovereign merchant, the East India Company. It's also an idea rooted in both British and Indian political thought. Hastings' influences are both back in Britain, where parliamentarians like Edmund Burke are talking about conciliation with the American colonies. Burke argues around this time that even the governments of the despotic governments of great empires are forced to truck and huckster, to behave like merchants. And it's also rooted in Mughal ideas of suli kul, or a kind of accommodation and negotiation. So for all kinds of reasons, this is a powerful idea at the time. Patronizing scholars is going to conciliate opinion of political classes. That's Hastings' idea. And it remains a mainstay of company ideology for much of the next 60 years. This idea survives even as Hastings is called back to Britain and put on trial. There's a new pressure on this idea of patronizing scholars for political reasons. Edmund Burke, now Hastings' prosecutor in Parliament, equates conciliation, as Hastings has been doing, with corruption. He says that all of this scholarly patronage was really a means of financial shady dealings. Hastings was really just covering up his embezzlement and his crimes. And yet the idea doesn't go away. Even as Hastings' immediate successor, who is a bit of a shady character, becomes a big backer of conciliation as well as a corrupt dealer in Bengal. Hastings' permanent successor, after this shady character Macpherson exits the scene, 18 months in power, is Charles Cornwallis. And Cornwallis, rather than do away with the idea of conciliation, tries to purify it, tries to make scholarly patronage again honorable by distancing himself a little bit from the personal affairs of scholars, setting up a more distant relationship between the company and scholars and their scholarly activities. By the mid-1790s, the need for this kind of caution has dissipated. Hastings is exonerated, and a new mood of public support for the company prevails back in Britain. A new challenge is on the horizon already, however, as Richard Wellesley sets sail for India in 1798. He poses a set of new challenges for the company. This is a governor general like Cornwallis and Hastings before, but one who has a really different idea of his role. He challenges the company's structure from within, wants to do away with its court of directors, with all the mercantile trappings of the company, all the mercantile role of the company. He thinks this is a sovereign in control of a great empire. It should no longer be acting like a merchant. And to support these new ideas of a kingly territorial sovereignty, with himself playing the role of king, of course, Wellesley sets up a new college in Calcutta for the East India Company's civil servants. This is a college that's going to hold grand disputations, invite dignitaries from across Asia, invite scholars from across Asia, and do all of this pomp and ceremony in support of the company's new role. Of course, the civil servants there are also being trained to handle new responsibilities, to act as governors and not only merchants. So there's a practical function here too, but it's also ideological. The college is a symbol of the company's new kingly territorial character, a character that Wellesley is trying to put in place of that old hybrid mercantile sovereignty. The directors back in London basically freak out over all of this and try to reduce the college. In fact, at first they try to abolish it altogether. Ultimately, they settle for just cutting its funding. They eventually succeed in recalling Wellesley, but some of the damage has been done. His new, more aggressive, expansionist views have really caught hold among a lot of the scholar officials in Calcutta, and they pursue grand projects over the succeeding decades. Indeed, in this period of 15 years or so after Wellesley's departure, ideas about knowledge continue to feature in challenges to the company's state, challenges often from within. Scholar officials tailor their projects to this aim of territorial expansion, to these grand ideas of an expansive territorial sovereignty without the old mercantile, commercial character of the company weighing it down. They envision big surveys of the company's new territories and populations under its control, projects to bring together all the flora and fauna and customs and manners of populations across India. All of this is befitting a grand empire and also supports further expansion. As you learn more about the peoples at the boundary, you can bring them under intellectual control as a prelude to territorial control. The company's leaders, as a result, back in London, who are holding to this hybrid commercial and political character of the company, see all of this as threatening and cut off support for scholars. That support that had been encouraged so long ago by Warren Hastings now is really on its last legs as the directors turn away from scholarly patronage, which they see as now threatening to their own role and to the survival of the company. At the same time, however, they start to be interested in something else, another channel for the support of knowledge, which is education initiatives. At this time, education initiatives, both in Europe and on the ground in India, are mostly in private hands. Missionaries, kind of educational reformers, philanthropists. This is not a state activity, education, so much as it is a private activity run by religious and other organizations. But the company sees a way to gain political advantage here. And this is really the subject of the last chapter of my book and the last phase of the company's existence. By the 1820s to 30s, demands for good government, both in India and in Britain, are on the rise. This is an age of reform. It's also an age of growing and increasingly self-confident publics. They're demanding more from their rulers. This is true back in Britain and across the British Empire too, including in British India. And native education becomes a key way that the company believes it can demonstrate its good government at this moment when it's being challenged to do so. And this incredible series of debates kicks off in every presidency of India and beyond, even in places like Singapore, over education. This old idea of conciliation comes back, Is it going to be necessary still to conciliate elites in Indian society as middlemen? Or can the company hope, in fact, to educate the mass of Indian society without the need for these old middlemen figures? I argue that this tension between conciliation on the one hand, this older language of scholarly patronage, and mass education, this new idea of kind of directly educating a much wider group of society, building a larger political constituency in the process. This is at root in even the famous Anglicist Orientalist controversy of the 1830s. If you haven't heard about that before, basically there's a lot of inflated rhetoric by people like Thomas Babington Macaulay, calling for English language and European content education, as opposed to the older Eastern language and Eastern content education of his opponents. And we've tended to think about this as an argument over culture and over language. I argue that in fact it's really at root an argument about whether to conciliate elites or educate the masses. These questions of language and culture are a rather thin layer on top of this pre-existing much greater debate between popular and elitist education policies. The outcome of this debate is briefly the triumph of English language instruction in India, but this has a brief moment only in the mid-1830s. The longer-lasting triumph is that of mass education over conciliation in company ideology. So over its last 20 years, the company commits, at least in principle, to mass education. I should hasten to add that it doesn't commit much in the way of finances to these projects, but it draws up by the early 1850s what it calls an intellectual charter for India, this grand plan to instill mass education across the subcontinent. It's out of power 3 years later, and this grand plan comes to nothing. But as a measure of its ideology and of its view of itself and the view that it wants its political interlocutors to have of it, things like the intellectual charter, things like these debates which involve so much ink being spilled over education, they do matter, and they do tell us a lot about the company and its politics. So in conclusion, I want to bring us up to the present. A present when we see books like this on the shelves all the time. Books about how higher education is becoming a business, universities have entered the marketplace, science is being conducted in the public interest, science is being privatized and turned over to pharmaceutical companies and the rest. How academic capitalism is a phrase that means something, and the rest of these kinds of buzzwords you may have heard, and phrases you may have read on books and articles. We live in a world, in other words, in which we think of the politics of knowledge as a contemporary issue. And we think of it as very much a new issue. We think of these as new phenomena. We don't think of them typically as having a history dating back much further than a few decades. And yet, as I've tried to show in this book, there's a long history of corporate involvement with knowledge, and we can learn something from it when it comes to approaching such issues in the present day. We don't have to enter these debates blind. I think, in fact, that the history of the company and its engagements with knowledge bears a few important lessons. One very general one is that companies today, too, are not only economic, but also political actors. What is a mission statement if not an ideology, a declaration of an ideology? So when Google claims to be organizing the world's information, this is an ideological claim. It's presenting this as a justification for its actions. And you see many other such statements about knowledge in corporate mission statements, too, not just Google's. But what this means, very importantly, is that companies are accountable to outside constituencies. Not only their board of directors, but also wider publics that it hopes to win over and convince of their good intentions. And this means, I think, that while we may be skeptical of the claims of companies to be enlightened today, just as so many were of those claims when the company made them in the past, The lesson might be that we ought to expect more rather than less from companies, more rather than less from corporations that claim to be spreading knowledge. After all, critics of the East India Company tended to have more success when they tried to hold the company up to its enlightened claims than when they simply dismissed the possibility of its ever meeting them. If we dismiss that possibility, we're foreclosing the ability to reform companies in the future and hold them up to our values. Friends of knowledge, I think, should take this lesson on board. And in a broader sense, the state, the company, and knowledge are all very malleable categories. Companies and states and knowledge have been really radically different concepts in the past. And relations among them have changed and can be changed in the future. So I think that while we may think of corporate encroachment of knowledge with a degree of skepticism in the present, this kind of involvement can be shaped and reshaped. It can be challenged and reformed. And that's one of the large lessons here when we look at this series of debates between the company and its critics. Critics were able to push the company to uphold its enlightened promises in many cases. That bears lessons for us today. So thanks, everyone. I look forward to any questions. And I'll try not to fall off the podium.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Joshua. That was excellent. When I read your book, I just read Nigel Biggar's Colonialism, and so I was beginning to question a number of the kind of deeply held views that I had, having been educated in the 70s and 80s, that viewed colonialism as being broadly always and everywhere a jolly bad thing. And it struck me that what I was reading when I read your book was a kind of post-colonialism. And in very particular terms, what struck me very, very strongly was what began, it seemed to me, as rather a cynical attempt to cover the company's rapacity, in the end became something that the company and the company's actors actually genuinely believed. And you could see that then transforming after the suppression of the company into some of those rather paternalistic attitudes to colonial education. But it seemed to me that you were making an argument that was very clear that certainly by the time of the suppression of the company in 1857, the actors in the company really believed that what they were about wasn't anything else other than the enlightened government of the territories under them. I mean, have I got that journey right? Is that what happens? They start with a kind of cynical attempt to cover their rapacity, and in the end, that cynical attempt becomes the governing idea for them.
I think I would suppose that there's a whole mix of attitudes. I think one thing that you point to very powerfully is just the sheer complexity of an organization like the company and of an empire, British or other. And there's a whole mix of interests and attitudes at play, I think, throughout this history. And I think it's probably fair to say that at certain moments there's more or less genuine feeling for knowledge prevailing among the company. There's a greater or smaller number of people who are seemingly genuinely committed to what they're doing. But I think you can find a mix of attitudes throughout this history. Instrumental uses of knowledge alongside very passionate and committed activities to educate or to explore or to find and add to the stock of knowledge. Many of the scholar officials, I have no doubt, were really doing it out of love for what they were doing. And then there was a politics around that as well on the part of many of the people around them. Of course, the activities of scholar officials were often a means for career advancement. If you could show that you were learned in certain languages, this had all kinds of purchase within the company's structure. So I think that it's a complex organism, the company, and quite a decentralized one. And you get a whole range of beliefs and attitudes throughout this long history. Where it all comes together is in the ideology of the company. And ideology, I take a minimalist definition of it in the book because I'm ultimately not sure if we can read the minds of people in the past and understand the depth of their commitment. What we do know is what they said that they believed, and we also know that this held them up to acting in accordance with what they said. And so that's where I try to pin my claims, at what they were saying they were doing and how that committed them to a certain course of action. And then the debates that ensued over what they were really doing as opposed to what they said they were doing, and critics, of course, jumped in and said that this was all disingenuous. But that's where I end up making my claim, is about the ideology that's stated and then debated. Less than claiming to know what they were really thinking, because I suspect that there's a whole range of degrees of disingenuousness and genuine commitment.
Josh, thank you very much for your very thorough presentation and introduction to this specific theme. I've had a chance to read a part of your book as well, and one thing that strikes me is the colossal power that this company had back in the days. And was it ever considered a threat to the British sovereign state as well? And maybe would this defense of knowledge be kind of a tactic to also legitimize it in face of the sovereign state itself? And so both questions. First, maybe was it a threat, and maybe what part did knowledge take in this defense against the state itself?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The company was absolutely seen as a threat by elements of the British government across this time period. It's seen as an empire within an empire, and threatening to unravel the British Constitution back at home. This is really Burke's main concern in the 1780s and 90s, that the company's going to not only cause havoc in India, but cause havoc back in Britain with all of its ill-gotten money and ill-gotten power. So it is seen as a threat throughout, and knowledge plays a role in making the company seem more legitimate to many different audiences, including, crucially, those power holders within the British government, like Parliament. The company can point to its enlightened activities and have these reported in the press back in Britain, in literary reviews, which talk about how great it is that Warren Hastings has sponsored these Bengali grammars and translations of Sanskrit epics. And who's reading these, of course, but members of Parliament and representatives of the Crown. And they're also an audience that can be reached through the personal influence of members of the company. A lot of these people are gentlemen scholars, kind of amateur scholars themselves, are very receptive to, during this period of the Enlightenment, very receptive to claims about spreading knowledge, and I think it does often work. It does seem to really have purchase in exactly the way Hastings thought it would. And of course, there's limits to that. If there's a famine happening, if there's wars going on and debts being incurred, there's a limit to what knowledge activities can launder. But I think the company does succeed at key moments in reforming its image by pointing to these kinds of activities, pointing to its role as a patron of scholars, a founder of universities, a publisher of books, a sponsor of scientific expeditions. All of this does help it reform its image in India and in Britain.
Okay, Joshua, I want to ask a simple question. I don't know if the answer is difficult. Can we see the East India Company as the first organization or quasi-state or anything, as the first to use soft power in history?
I think that it is building on a long line of efforts by all kinds of organizations, including companies, to do something that might very well be called soft power or corporate social responsibility, to use another modern term. For a long time, and I'm glad you asked this question because it helps fill in some of the background to the company and what it's doing. for a long time, companies, including also things like guilds, municipal corporations, not only business corporations, but all kinds of corporate entities, were involved in charitable enterprises, were involved in sponsoring scholars, were involved in things in the public good. And so the company is very much building on that legacy. I think what makes it different is the extent of its activities, which correspond to the extent of its power and resources. It's doing something new because it's in this unprecedented position in Asia, and it has this ability to add to knowledge in ways that no company before did. So I think that is quite new. And so it's on a bigger scale. But I don't suppose that it's the first company to sponsor knowledge. I think it just makes more political hay out of it, and it does it on a bigger scale. But thanks for asking, because I didn't fill in that background, and it's I think there, when it comes to what the company's up to, it has certain models that it can draw on, even though it's taking those to new heights.
Sorry, and when you mentioned these models that it might have followed through or followed up on, do you think there might be any comparison between, say, the Jesuit expeditions in Asia and the company's activities
Oh, sure, yeah.
in Asia as well?
Yeah, I mean, we can think of the Jesuits as a kind of corporate body, too. Not corporate in a kind of business sense, but an incorporated group with activities of all kinds, including the political, including the scholarly, including the commercial. And indeed, a group that, sorry?
And knowledge, for sure. That's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and including knowledge. And I think that the company, so it did have certain precedents to draw on in Asia too. I would just suppose that it was in a position in command of such a large territory that the Jesuits and others before had not been. Its operations were on a different scale, is what I'm saying.
In that sense, would you say it is more like some of the enlightened, or perhaps not always quite as enlightened rulers, going back much further, magnificence was seen as a feature of courts, say Henry VIII, Francois I of France, the Habsburgs, they all competed in many ways as to who could patronize scholars, music, painters, art, culture, broadly interpreted. This was seen as one of the marks of prestige and power, soft power, if you like, of a government, that it could put on a great show to impress both the masses but also the educated elite within the country and from elsewhere.
Yes, and Asian rulers did this too. Mm-hmm. So the Mughal governors of Bengal, people like Hastings, were continually being told by the remnants of that old political elite in Bengal, as well as European interpreters of that Mughal legacy. Hastings was always being told about how they had patronized scholars, and scholars were treated as princes by the rulers of India before the British got there, and that he had to maintain this role if he was going to maintain their legitimacy and step into their halls of power and sit on their throne.
Mm-hmm. Mind you, of course, when the scholars, be it Erasmus or Voltaire, happened to disagree with their patrons, they often found that they had to leave the court in something of a hurry.
Yeah, there are many examples in this context too of scholars who get on the wrong side of the East India Company and of leaders in India, and are, despite their best efforts to curry favor with their scholarly activities, are
cast into outer darkness.
Yeah, fall into disrepute because of one thing or another. Get too close to one leader, another comes into power, and they're seen as a threat. That kind of thing happens all the time. So politics intrudes on scholarship very often in the story.
The company was here for a few decades before the beginning of Hong Kong. Is there any impact of that knowledge politics by the company?
Yes, absolutely. So Macau comes up occasionally in this book. I wouldn't say it's the central concern, but it's something I'm very interested in, and I always note those references in the company's records. Certainly it was part of this network of both politics, commerce, and scholarship that crossed Asia. And for instance, when the company wanted to set up a printing press in Calcutta, or no, I have the other way around. When Morrison wanted to print the Bible in Macau, he turned to Calcutta-based Indian textile printers who had experience, putting ink on a carved block, carving the block themselves perhaps, and then pressing it onto cloth. So they seemed like the people to turn to engage in printing activities in Macau. And so this is just one example of personnel and expertise crossing between Calcutta and Macau. There are many others. Macau is really another port city in this link of port cities like Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, Malacca, Singapore, Penang, that were under the control of the company. Macau, not formally, of course, but it was a power base for the company during the off-season when they couldn't trade in Canton. So it's very much a part of this chain. And again, knowledge as well as material goods are passing through all of these places. And you see traces of that in the records pretty consistently. And knowledge about China is often coming through Macau and entering the scholarship of company figures. That's another thing that comes up sometimes in this book. In fact, that College of Fort William that I mentioned, they wanted to hire a Chinese instructor, as did the missionaries just upriver at the Danish settlement of Serampore, and they were collaborating often with the college. And who did they find but an Armenian from Macau who had learned Chinese and was going to be able to translate the Bible into Chinese. That's what the missionaries cared about. The professors of the college cared more generally about learning Chinese and being able to teach students Chinese. So you get connections like that too. An Armenian trader from Macau coming over to Calcutta and being enlisted by the company for scholarly purposes. I'm thinking of more as I talk, but these come up not infrequently.
Thank you, Joshua. I have a question about the knowledge with respect to the China trade. I went through the East India Company records, of course, and I was so surprised that there was a whole bottom layer of information missing. Mm-hmm. And that really amazed me because I kept asking people at the library, where's the rest of the documents? There's something missing here. And I say this because up into, well, my work, I guess, the China trade was largely defined from the East India Company records, the English East India Company, and the Chinese records together. And I started going into the Dutch East India Company and the Danish and the Swedish, and a whole nother layer of documents, information was in those records that was not in the East India Company records. So after researching many years in the other archives, a whole different story emerged from what the English East India Company had generated. Because of that lower level documents were missing. And my explanation for those not being created was the company was just too big. It couldn't handle the little minute information. It had to deal with the higher level. So all of the journals, the expense records, they eliminate all the day-to-day stuff and they go right to monthly costs. Forget everything else. Monthly, or in some cases, annual costs. and you eliminate the monthly costs because it's just too big, they can't deal with it. But as a consequence of that, the officers who were in China, they kept records in Macau and in Canton, so they could go back 50 years and see what happened in the trade. They're getting incomplete information all the time because that whole bottom layer is gone. They have to deal with a higher level. And when you compare that to the other records, just an entirely different story comes out. That's completely contrary to what you get from the English East India Company records. So I don't know what to make of that, but there's definitely something that's very different between the East India Companies. The smaller East India Companies kept track of everything. You can go right down to their daily diet. I mean, you know exactly what they're eating every day. And you know who gave it to them. You know who cooked it for them. You know who bought the vegetables for them. You know how many cows they butchered every day. That is completely gone in the English records. All you have is just the top level. And I think that that's part of the problem of the British. When I go through and analyze the supercargoes in Canton and Macau, and they're analyzing like a home merchant, or they're analyzing what's happening in the trade. And then I compare that to what's in the Dutch records, what's in the Danish records. Where are they getting this from? It's that they're missing that whole bottom layer. So they have really incomplete knowledge that they're basing their decisions on. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed at some point, like with what you're doing with the knowledge base.
Well, I'm fascinated by this comparison, and I have to defer to you both on the records of the China trade and the records of some of these other East India companies. I can say a little bit though about what I've noticed when it comes to the British East India Company's archives. A lot was sent back to London, but not everything. And so if you do go, as I did, to archives around India, which retained the original records, copies of some of which only were then sent back to London, you do get other kinds of records that are missing from the central archive in London. So proceedings, which were pretty regular, but again, probably maybe not dealing with every aspect of day-to-day operations, those did get sent back, and they're very voluminous. I mean, the company's records in the British Library are measured in kilometers, a number of kilometers. I don't know how many, like 7 or something. But there are things like, I was just thinking about this the other day, the Madras district records are not sent back to London. A number of attachments to proceedings are not sent back to London, and this is especially glaring in the later period. The records of various different councils and boards that were not the executive council don't go back to London. So if you want to study the formation of education policy, for instance, all of that you have to do in Calcutta, in West Bengal, because all of the records of the General Committee of Public Instruction are there, and very few of them only were kind of excerpted and sent to London. They're also organized differently, and so finding information is done very differently if you do it in London, and as the company did it in London, versus if you do it in these Indian archives. And so the information is quite scattered. I'm not sure how much this is a case of information not being recorded, and how much it's a case of information being recorded in many different places and not always being sent back to the British Library, or well, at the time, the East India House, and now retained in the British Library. It may be a mix of both.
I did find a few things from Canton, but one of the problems is they lease their ships rather than own them. So all of the shipping records and all of the provisions for the ships is not in the East India Company records. So that's one of the problems. That's different from the other East India companies. But still, it's compared to the Dutch and the Danish East India companies. They sent back triplicates of almost everything. Okay, so a ship goes down, still got 2 more copies. Another ship gets captured by an enemy, still got 1 copy. And you can go into those Danish archives, you can go into the Dutch archives, and you have just about everything's right there. Sometimes 3 copies, sometimes 4 copies. They make it all back. You go in the British archive, you're lucky if you can find 1. So there's definitely a big difference between the way they're operating. That the whole lower level is just almost completely gone.
As a more of an amusing than definitive counterexample, I was just doing research in Sri Lanka over the Chinese New Year break, and so this is a case where you had first the Portuguese arriving, then the Dutch, and then the British, and there are records from all of those administrations, especially the British one that lasted the longest. But those British governors who arrive in the 1790s, first under the East India Company, shortly after under the Crown, are convinced that the Dutch were the most slovenly record keepers, and there are all these descriptions of just how bad they were at keeping records. And I don't put much stock in that. I think it's just, I don't know.
Prejudice.
Yeah, it's just kind of inter-imperial prejudice. But it was funny, and your comments put me in mind of that comparing between administrative regimes, which I think would make for some great articles if you haven't already read them. Haven't already written them.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that the people on the ground who are making the decisions, like here in Macau and in Guangzhou, they don't have the information to go on. They can't look it up. The Dutch can. The Dutch kept copies of all their records right here, so they could go back 50 years and they could tell you what they paid for apples. They can tell you what the wages were for all of their Chinese servants just by looking in their records. They can't do that with the British. So the people on the ground are making decisions based on incomplete information.
Well, here's another hypothesis. I wonder if this is, and I'm speculating here, related to the somewhat marginal status of the China trade when it came to the East India Company's operations. Not in the later phase, but there's much more of an administration on the ground in India. It's much more permanent, much more expansive, and it starts earlier and has its own logic that maybe doesn't carry over in full to the China branch of the operations. Maybe that's related here.
Well, I think that's definitely part of the discussion. I've used the Madras records and Fort William, the early ones, and that quite a bit of detail is in those records. But still, nothing compared to what you get in the Dutch records. I mean, you know how much they paid to cut their hair every day. So I mean, you got everything in there. You can, what kind of perfume they're wearing, the women are wearing. Everything's there. So it definitely is a difference between
Yeah, it's interesting.
knowledge that's available to the people on the ground.
Well, if there is one thing that makes historians really happy, it's having a great discussion of archival sources and what is and is not there. And I'm glad to see we've started this. I am sure that the discussion could go on for much longer. I'm also aware that we have some light refreshments outside, and perhaps you would like to continue your exploration or comparison of what you all know about different archives over a glass of wine and some nibbles. So at this point, I think that I will perhaps draw at least the formal part of the proceedings this evening to an end. I want to thank our speaker very much for a really stimulating and interesting talk from which I have learnt a great deal, and I'm off tomorrow to actually go online at Hong Kong U, which has got your book online already, and start reading through it even before the paperback comes out. I'd also like to thank our audience for the interest that you have shown in this topic, which is, of course, the greatest compliment that you can pay to a speaker. And now I think let's just end by indicating our gratitude to the Cunha Foundation once more for allowing us to use their premises for this series of events, which I know you've got an anniversary, a load of events coming up for that, but we already have 2 more talks on very different topics booked for May, and I'm liaising with the speakers at the moment to get all the information. One will be on maps, and one will be on films about Macau. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again in the not too dim and distant future. Meanwhile, thank you very much indeed, Philippa, for all that you've done to make tonight's event happen. Okay.
Thank you.